Yo, hello. Today we are back once again for the monthly Heroic Grail tier list update, this time with the context of CYL7 in the game, as well as a bunch of other additions that they did, including new inheritable skills and weapons, and additional Grand Hero battle units and Tempest Trial stuff. Basically more or less what we usually get per month scenario, but I think this is probably going to be one of the bigger updates when it comes to overall placement changes, mainly due to what new tools we've gotten in the game that are probably going to be really prevalent moving forward. In any case, we have plenty of new stuff to review, so we may as well get right into it. And by get right into it, I mean you could either skip to the first section or whatever section you're interested in. And for anybody new to the series or videos entirely, hi, hello. Here are the must-knows for any sort of context for everything going into this video. The video will consist of 3 tier lists, one for Aether, Summoner Duels, and Arena. And at the end of the video, I'll be doing a cumulative ranking based on the best placement among all 3 tiers, and give some personal recommendations for who you should spend your heroic grails on. This does also take max investment into consideration, but be wary that some units will take a lot more resources to build than others simply because of how old they are. And if you're just looking for specific game modes to take into consideration, you can take any list on their own individual basis. Otherwise, if you have any other feedback or question, make sure to leave it in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But with that, we may as well get started with the Aether Raids tier list. As far as new Aether Raids updates go, there really isn't much noteworthy when it comes to the Grail specifically, but there is a lot of new additions that, in my opinion, can shake up a lot of what the game is going to be moving forward. And this isn't necessarily just an Aether Raids thing per se, I think it's a general game mode thing overall. But for Aether Raids specifically, we do have Freyr, who was introduced last month. I didn't get to cover him last time, but I'm going to do it here. He's basically the solution to Element by removing any and all penalties at the start of either phase, which means not only you're removing false start, but you're also removing stuff like isolation, sabotage, panic, you name it. It removes pretty much anything that could be considered a penalty to the point where you can run a lot more stuff on Aether Raid's defense, including more Anima Mythics who just won't instantly lose to an Element. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. We did also get Trevant's new refine, Tea Time Tail 2, and Cyril. Trevant's Thracia Kinglance refine honestly isn't that bad in my opinion. I think it's more or less the equivalent of an Arcane Chiang, but with the added benefit of also debuffing a flat amount of attack, which can be good for general tanking. It is based on his visible defense at the start of combat, so you can't really stack it through drives or spurs, but that still doesn't hurt anyway because it's just extra stats that he gets along the way on top of the Spectrum 8 that he has from his weapon. He also has Guard and Breath for Hit, which can also make charging specials and tanking even easier for him. And while he doesn't have Slaying, I don't think that's going to be that big of a problem moving forward because we also got the introduction of Gambit, which is essentially a flat amount of damage reduction and true damage based on the cooldown count of his special. For example, if he has a 5 cooldown special such as Miracle, he's getting 50% flat damage reduction from his B slot and 15 points of true damage per hit, which means in some cases locking Slaying isn't the worst thing by any means. Now, I will mention that Guard Bearing 4 does exist and it does grant more first hit damage reduction, 60% for the first combat in the enemy phase, but Gambit does allow you to enter multiple combats without reducing the amount of damage reduction that you're getting from it. And overall, with the amount of stats that he's getting from his weapon on top of Guard, Breath, and just a lot of the new skills that we've gotten in the game, I would argue he's a pretty competent melee specialist now. You would use him with Guidance and Gambit 4, and preferably if you could stack up as much visible defense as possible, that would be great. I don't really recommend something like Solid Ground because he does get a good amount of resistance from his weapon, not only the Spectrum 8, but also whatever he debuffs. So at the cost of 2 attack, Fortress Defense Res, or unless we get a better one in the future, is probably going to be the next best thing you could give him just for the extra visible stats and debuffs. Otherwise, we did have Tail 2 and Cyril. Tail 2 is more or less another generic Green Tome who got added right before the BST bump, which is going to be important later on, but for the time being, she has a relatively decent offensive stat line. She has access to a good amount of Green Tomes, including Snow Globe and the recently added Tea Cake Tower and Tea Time set, which the former not as strong as the latter, but the latter grants no follow-up attack speed +5 and Canto 1, which is entirely fixed, which means you don't have to be as worried about extending your movement if you are worried about hit and run strategies. But for what it's worth, I do think you could use her in a dark defense setting for something like Aether Raids with Legendary Robin and stack up triple Unity stuff with Snow Globe and attack speed Unity. She has access to enough stuff in her archetype to where I don't think she'd be that bad overall, but there are definitely better nukes. That being said, magical no follow-up, times +4, Snow Globe, and Legendary Robin support she's going to be hitting pretty hard overall. So for a generic, I don't think she's too bad. And as for Cyril, he did come with a PRF in Aptitude Arrows, which is a Spectrum 10 weapon that grants penalty neutralization and true damage based on his speed. I don't think that weapon is bad by any means. I think my biggest issue mainly comes with the fact that the other options he has access to are intrinsically better. You'll probably find a lot more success running something like Arcane Darkbow with something on the Catria Ball instead of his PRF, as he'll probably end up dealing a lot more damage, assuming that there isn't Vantage, Hardy Bearing, or any sort of ability to stop his doubles. He'll more or less be able to quad attack before the foe can counter, which will be solid for damage output in general. Flash Sparrow, Spiral 4 with Luna, and with Attack Speed Oath and Blade Session, he's going to have a really easy time getting a good amount of damage out. His stat line is also incredibly solid with a very high amount of base attack and speed. And while we're not at this section yet, he is also a trainee, so he has a BST bump on top of the CYL BST bump that we already get. But regardless, all three units, well, I would definitely say they have a mix in viability. You'll probably find more usage out of Cyril out of the gate, mainly because he doesn't take as much investment to get going, and even if you don't have the arcane, he's still going to be able to do a good amount of work. Tail 2 will require a fair amount of investment because she doesn't have any sort of PRF weapon to go by, and some of her best weapon options are locked behind seasonal events, so it's going to be a bit tough for her specifically, but if you can get them, I don't think she's going to be doing too bad. But it is also worth mentioning that she is a bit more dependent on her allies than the other two specifically. And as for Trevant, while he is definitely the oldest of the bunch, he definitely has the highest ceiling going for him, mainly because melee flyers are probably in the best spot in the meta currently. I'm going to get into this when we get to the Summer Duel section, but really the main thing I want to get into is with Freyr, because I think he's going to shift a lot of stuff going forward for Aether's defenses. As I did mention earlier, he does shut off every single penalty in Anima Season, so as long as you just have him deployed, you can't debuff the team as long as they're within range of him. But this was probably an overcorrection to Elamine, who in my opinion should not have been in the game to begin with, at least not with False Start, because False Start is a really absurd effect that really has no place in FEH. Because without him, a majority of the Anima Season mythics are just completely worthless. But now that we have Dream Deliverer and Freyr, it makes a lot more strategies in Anima Season way more competent, and it solidifies a lot of niches for these units that would have otherwise struggled in it. For example, Duma, who can break structures, which can be nice if you're looking for turn 1 engagements. Lif, who had his whole Quick and Pulse Special Spiral 4 effect that he really couldn't get off because Elamine shut it off and it was only turn 1. And Hardy Fighter in general, which can protect you from a lot of far-saved threats. Elamine shutting off all of these was very problematic for the state of Anima defense, and with Freyr being a thing, now you could use a lot of these units with a lot more success. Granted, I think Formotus was definitely a bit better off comparatively to the other two, but now you don't have to struggle as much using the other Anima mythics. And it's not even just these three. You could still go with Oder, which he's not really the best, but you could still use him, Thurseer, etc., etc. You have a lot more viable options now as long as you have Freyr on the team. But outside of Freyr, I did want to mention the Brave Soren, who could grant a decoy to any unit with the highest defense, and if they match, it can be granted to multiple units, which means that not only can you have solid frontliners like Har, Summer Male Shez, with Guard Bearing, Guidance 4, or even Gambit, or any of those, but now you could also have them protect your team from any sort of melee threat. It isn't exactly a direct power creep from just regular near saves in my opinion, because it does take an entire turn to set up, so if they do go in turn 1, it's not going to be as effective, but after turn 1, it's going to be very, very consistent. And I think these are the big things when it comes to the Aether rates changes this month. There isn't really a lot of noteworthy things overall, but rather than any notable positions changing, I think these two units alone definitely solidify a lot of Aether rates niches that weren't as consistent before, but can now allow for a lot more strategies. There were a couple changes, but nothing so drastic that it was really worth mentioning earlier. The main thing was definitely going to be Counter Roar 4 with New Year Kaiser, because he can instantly retaliate with a bonfire, he gets true damage from his weapon, he has breath, you could use attack, defense, finish, Counter Roar 4 so he gets damage reduction and reflects a lot more damage back, and because he's infantry, he could also use Times Pulse 4 and just continually stack up his attack and defense. And while he's not necessarily the crazy craziest unit, he's definitely a lot more usable now than he was definitely prior, and I think he could definitely find some usage with something like Counter Roar 4. Granted, you will have to be careful about his transformation gimmick, because without any sort of beast skill, he's definitely not going to get it off as consistently, but if you can position him in a way where he gets the transformation and can set up without being near allies that removes the transformation after that turn, I think he's going to be well off. And really the only other thing is a demotion of Valentine's Lissa. She doesn't really do much. She has nice stats, but her being a staff is probably the biggest detriment to her. She doesn't have a lot of defensive capabilities outside of her stats, which isn't really going to be cutting it nowadays, because you could simply pop her with any sort of special, true damage, or anything of the sort that makes tanking a lot harder. And I think comparatively to a lot of other units that could use stuff like Savvy or any sort of other fighter skill with a special like Armored Beacon, she's just not going to be cutting it as much. But like I said, when it comes to Aether rates, it's not really as big of an update. I think there were some notable things worth highlighting, which is why I wanted to talk about them, but I think most of the notable changes are definitely going to be coming from Summoner Duels, as a lot of the new inheritables, including the new units that we did get from CYL 7, are going to be a really big game changer overall. And we may as well get right into that, because there's a lot more significant changes here than there were definitely in the Aether rates tier list. I think moving forward, Brave Soren's Savior gimmick is going to be extremely noteworthy. And while there are definitely a lot of candidates that can make good use of it, you know, enemy phase units with Brave, good amounts of damage reduction, piercing, just a lot of good defensive capabilities, I think the strongest units that can take advantage of his Savior gimmick are melee flyers, because not only do you have the protection of allowing a unit to teleport in through guidance, but you can then act as a near save, which means you have complete protection from any sort of melee threat as long as they have the damage reduction and stats to make it work. And with a lot of the melee flyers that we do have, on top of the inheritables they have access to, I think there's a very good argument that you can make for a lot of melee flyers. But I do want to quickly go into the new units and the Trevant refine first before I go any more into my thoughts over here. Trevant, it's more or less going to be the same as I described it in the Aether rates tier list, but for those who skipped over here, Thracia King Lance is more or less a side grade of Arcane Chang. It has basically everything that weapon has, except instead of slaying, it has Daunt, which is just attack penalties on the foe during combat, and it has Guard. So tanking comparatively to Chang is going to be significantly better with Thracia King Lance. And now with the new Gambit skill that we do have, he could get even more damage reduction from Gambit. And while we did have something like Guard Bearing 4 earlier, I do think Gambit is a really noteworthy side grade, because it's a flat amount of damage reduction comparatively to Guard Bearing 4, where multiple combats will reduce it from 60 to 30%. But even so, I wouldn't say one is necessarily stronger over the other, although I do think some melee flyers prefer one over the other. That being said, Thracia King Lance, with all the stats that it gives, Breath, Guard, Gambit, Fortress Defense Res, and Guidance 4 with Soren near save support, I think he's going to be extremely competent. And while I wouldn't say he's necessarily the echelon of melee flyers, he's definitely good nowadays. And if you did want to build him and you were kind of on the fence as to whether or not you wanted to build Trevant, I don't think you're going to go wrong with him by any means. Meanwhile, with Tea Time Teotihu and Cyril, it's more or less going to, again, be the same as it was earlier. I think Teotihu does get a bit more flexibility in her kit, because when it comes to something like Summoner Duels, everything is an action by action basis, so you get a lot more of the effects ready out of the gate. You could use stuff like Spiral 4, Times Pulse 4, Flare, and a lot of other stuff that just continually bolsters her stats and damage output. Again, it's mainly going to be equivalent to how it was prior, but because you're in a much more controlled environment, you could definitely take advantage of it much more easily. And I do think if you did have to bring her the Summoner Duels, she could always put in the work, but it is also worth noting that you're basically running 2 double unity weapons, because the one unit that does enable a lot of this stuff is Legendary Male Robin, who is also a green infantry tome. But even so, she could still do plenty of work if you did want to bring her there. And with Cyril, you definitely want to give him Arcane Darkbow, because it does pair well with stuff like Catria and Winter Cordelia. It's going to be equivalent to how you would run him in an Aether rates defense setting. You'd want to pair him up with a Brave attack, so you could definitely get 4 attacks out before the foe can counter. And because his stat line is relatively solid, I don't think you're going to be missing a lot of speed checks half the time, unless it's up against a lot of speedy Giga Whale units. You could always keep his PRF, but I don't think it really synergizes well with a lot of the stuff in the game, which is mainly penalty neutralization. And while Arcane Darkbow also has penalty neutralization, it does have a desperation effect and half null follow-up, so you don't have to worry about your skill slots as much. And with the slaying effect, you could always give him C Feud and just consistently charge up Luna's Spiral 4s and get a good amount of damage out. Overall, I do think all three of them can function relatively well. Some of them are a bit more dependent on other allies than others, but I don't think any of them are bad by any means. I think some of them definitely require a bit more investment than others, but what unit doesn't these days? There are two other things I quickly want to go over before I go back to the placement changes, and that's Brave Soren and Brave Robin. Brave Soren's savior gimmick works based on the weapon range of the targeted ally. For example, if your targeted ally has a range of 2, they're going to be acting as a far save. And if they have a range of 1, they're always going to be acting as a near save. And because of the ability to allocate far save and near save rolls through Soren, a lot of the notable armors that you could have used from the Grail shop could arguably be superseded by pretty much any other class that has the effectiveness going for them. I think near saves in particular definitely suffer the most for this because you could just run any sort of competent melee flyer, infantry. Cavs, I'm not sure as much, but you could still find usage there. But I think the big ones are definitely going to be melee flyers and infantry because of all the skills they have access to. And the fact that they don't really have any class weaknesses as near saves can be beneficial, whereas a lot of other armors could easily get popped by any sort of armor effectiveness. And when it comes to far save options, the reason you generally find a lot of far saves to be one range, you know, swords, lances, axes, all those, is because they have access to Hardy Fighter, which allows them to get so much more damage reduction and tanking prowess that it makes the roll much more significant than if you are going to be using it with any sort of ranged equals 2 armor, which they could still pull it off if needed, but the potency is not going to be nearly as high. And now that we have other options that could take up the role as far saves, you may not necessarily need somebody like Felix or Winter Ignatz built up, even if they can work. And I think what makes this change different comparatively to Aether Raids is that Aether Raid still requires an entire turn for it to get going, so having a far save ready out of the gate is always going to be nice, but because everything activates all at once in Summoner Duels, you don't really have to worry about it as much in that mode. So in a bit, you'll definitely see a lot more changes when it comes to armors and far saves and a lot of those. And the other thing I wanted to mention was Brave Robin and Flared Sparrow. Flared Sparrow I'll get into in a second, but that's not really the bigger highlight here. I think the biggest highlight here is definitely going to be Brave Robin's Tip the Scales, because it is a global in-combat times pulse effect, which, depending on the weapon that you do have, can grant either 1 cooldown or 2 cooldown, which can make special manipulation really insane. For example, Kronia has no sling in her weapon, but she has instant vantage, access to lethality, and spiral, and if you were to make her into something like a far save with Soren support, with special spiral in her B slot and Brave Robin support, she can always retaliate with an instant lethality, which can be incredibly strong if the foe doesn't have any sort of miracle effects. There are also a lot of the other units that don't have access to special manipulation gimmicks such as Times Pulse and all those. So somebody like Summer Alencia or any sort of mounted unit can also take advantage of Tip the Scales because they could get specials off way more easily. And I think the bows in particular will definitely benefit because while they don't have access to stuff like Times Pulse, they do have the Arcane, which not only grants slaying, but with Tip the Scales, if they are able to double, they'll always get a Dead-Eye off on the second hit, which is incredibly beneficial. And with the new addition of Flared Sparrow, which is this new fiery terrain thing that we're getting in the game, there's definitely a lot more reason to use stuff such as cavalry and flyers, because now you can set up a lot of movement shenanigans that can make tanking and defensive play way more easy. But as for placement changes, I do want to quickly talk about those in the superb and solid category. I did mention that moving forward, this is probably going to be the second coming of saviors, where these are probably going to be the most predominantly meta stuff to come out of the game as of recent times. Not to say that saves have lost their niche, but melee flyers are definitely the next thing that are going to be really important to have around. And I think the combination of Guard Bearing 4, Guidance 4, and Soren's near save gimmick makes them incredibly potent as supports and mixed utility units that can also perform in combat. And out of the ones that were already good, they're definitely still going to be superb, but I think units such as Masquerade Eldigan and Bride Larm are especially great because not only do they have all their good skill accessibility, but Eldigan has a really solid defense stat, and Larm can take advantage of her speed stat by running something like Lewin. They can do their near save gimmicks, they have guidance, and they have access to dance, which means they can provide more utility than most Grail melee flyers in the game, and I think that's going to be incredibly good moving forward. That being said, you could also have some that are a lot more competent in combat because of stuff like Florid Cane and Gambit. If you initiate combat on a unit with Guard Bearing 4, you're going to lose that 60% in the enemy phase, but with Gambit, you're always getting a consistent amount, so you could still enter combat with something like Forward Cane Record, go back, get true damage reduction, and still be very good for enemy phase purposes. I don't think there's really any downside to that per se. You could also have some of your slower ones just stack up a load of attack and defense, so even in a scenario where you don't have access to Gambit, you could still act as a very competent near save with something like Guard Bearing 4, Guidance, and just a bunch of stat boosters. And in my opinion, this is probably going to be some of the best stuff going forward. Being a melee flyer right now is not bad by any means, and I think especially for units that may have been written off initially, like Spring Michaelis, they can do very, very good work, and I would be very shocked to see otherwise. Otherwise, we do have the promotion of a lot of melee calves because of the ability to run Flared Sparrow and Gambit, which can make damage output a lot better and setting up terrain effects much more consistent. I think a lot of the terrain gimmicks that we're going to be getting moving forward is going to be incredibly beneficial to have in a Summoner Duel setting, as it can prevent a lot of movement shenanigans depending on the foe that you go up against. And because Flared Sparrow isn't necessarily range locked, it's only cav and flyer locked, you can give this to pretty much anyone, and if they have the stats to work with, you can set it up really, really easily. I decided to promote the rest of the melee units that could take advantage of these skills. And while I definitely don't think they're going to be the best of the best when it comes to it, I think they could still find a lot more usage now than the month prior to the update. And lastly, I did want to quickly talk about AoEs because I think moving forward, it's going to be a lot more difficult for stuff like Arcane Eclipse users to really get that stuff going because of stuff like Stone Terrain from Brave Corn, who is most likely going to be a very common threat just because of the amount of utility that she grants to the player. Not only is she a decent far save, but she also has the Stone Terrain, which grants AoE protection. And even that aside, I feel like AoEs do need some sort of true damage attached to it in order to really secure their ability to get damage output and kills. And a majority of the Arcane Eclipse users really can't do that because they don't have access to a lot of damage piercing or any sort of true damage gimmicks. And maybe in the future they'll get something, but for the time being, I think the best thing to do would probably be to demote them all the way down to can work. I think they can work, but it's definitely going to be a lot more finicky now going forward. And other than that, it's another Valentine's listed demotion because, yeah, ranged armors aren't exactly the best, and not having access to any sort of defensive capabilities isn't great either, so I'm moving her down. And beyond that, that's pretty much it when it comes to the Summoner Duels tier list. Lastly, we have the Arena tier list, which is a tier list, quote unquote, and it's mainly just about scoring. But with the new system that I introduced last month, I'm also going to be talking about what season I would personally recommend them in, because if you do end up building a lot of these units, it would be beneficial for you to use them in a setting where they can actually perform. But for the time being, we have Zero, who is the best scoring Grail unit in the game, because not only did he get the new BST bump with CYL, but he's also a trainee, so he can score 762 points in Arena alongside Murdoch and Vergard, which are the three highest scoring units in the game. And because of the BST bump that we did get, I decided to move a lot of the units down that can't really score above 756, which more or less is going to be a lot of the units that have to run dual skills. You still have a good amount of options for arena scoring purposes. Anyone from the 760 bin like Lumera, which I assume a lot of people built, Hans, or even 758 with stuff like Summer Shez, Garen, Geralt. A lot of the popular ones, although I don't think Garen is as popular, there's still plenty of options at your disposal for scoring. But everyone else is definitely going to be a lot more finicky because they either score 756 in arena or score a lot less. Trevant now scores 756 because he has a PRF weapon, but it's a little bit too late in my opinion for scoring purposes. If you did want to try and use him, you could always try, but I don't think you're going to get as much mileage out of it. Nor do I think you're going to get mileage out of it with Tea-Time Tail 2 because she doesn't really score all too well either. She doesn't have a PRF, and while she does hit 180 BST naturally, she still only scores 754 in Arena. But that being said, if you did want to use any of these units in Arena, I recommend the following seasons. Starting with Water Season, I think you could either run Trevant here, or you could run them in Fire Season. The initial reason I had all these Lance Flyers in Water Season was because of the fact that they couldn't really take on Legendary Edelgard all too well. They have access to Gambit 4, which is always going to be a consistent 50% damage reduction, whereas Guard Bearing 4 was 60 into 30 into 30, which could definitely prove trouble for a lot of the Chang users. And even with Gambit 4, she can still run through a majority of them. But the reason I also offer the idea for Fire Season is because of the amount of attack he debuffs from Thracia Kinglands, it does allow him to shrug off legendary Edelgard and kill her back in retaliation. But this is also based on the assumption that it goes exactly how it was in the Duel Simulator, but even then, he's going to have the best chance at it comparatively to any other Lance Flyer. And while Ninian does prevent counterattacks from any sort of blue units, she isn't able to cut through a lot of the guard-bearing damage reduction, which does make a lot of their placements in Water Season a lot more noteworthy. If you're able to bait out the Dancer, which you can easily do with any sort of blue unit, I do think you could find a good amount of mileage just running them in the Water Season and taking a hit if necessary. But if you didn't want to run Trevant in Water Season, you could always bring him to Fire Season, but you will have to be careful here or there. And then we have Ciro, who's probably going to be a really popular merge project because of the amount of score he gets in Arena. Even if he himself isn't exactly the best, you can still use him in something like Win Season, because not only does he prevent any sort of debuffs and penalties from any foe on the opposing team, so somebody like Gunthra, Legendary Lucina, etc., but because he also has penalty neutralization, he could take advantage of Eliwood's bonus doubler effects and get stuff like Panto and bonus doubler and all that really good stuff that can allow him to perform much better in something like Arena. I don't think it's necessarily the best effect to have around, but it does have its usage, and if you did want to bring him somewhere where he could probably take advantage of his stats much more often, he's probably going to have a lot more success in something like Win Season because of the amount of stats he could simply stack up and not get any penalization for. And lastly, there's Tea Time Teotihu, and while I don't think a lot of her matchups are going to be particularly great in most seasons, although you could definitely argue Water Season because of the fact that there are just a majority of blues there, I think her ability to triple stack Unity with something like Legendary Robin is very, very beneficial for just stat stacking overall. And with Unity in the A slot, Weapon Seal, and the visible buff, she could get a really absurd amount of stats, which I think can be very beneficial if you were to run her with Legendary Robin. But I think the two biggest points of contention are A, she doesn't really score too much, and B, you still have to tie her to Legendary Robin. But if you did want to bring her to kill blues, you could definitely bring her to Water Season, but I think her best performance is definitely going to come about when you have somebody like Legendary Robin paired with her because of the triple Unity stack. And otherwise, that's about it when it comes to the Arena list and all the tier lists. I think for the most part, a lot of the recommendations are going to be staying the same because a lot of these units just do a great amount of stuff. But now instead of Lumera being there, I put Ciro in her place because he simply scores much higher and is probably going to be a very decent score bot for the next year or two because of the trainee bump that he does have. But if you really aren't focused on any sort of scoring or save orientation, you could really just build up a good amount of melee flyers because I think at this time, they're probably some of the best investments you can make in the game. Even if they are really, really expensive to do, I think the payoff is going to be much more significant than any sort of other unit in the Grail shop. But you'll have to let me know how you feel about that down below because there's plenty of awesome candidates that you can use from the Grail shop since there's so many tools in the game for them to take advantage of. But let me know what your thoughts are down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.